The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that made every breath feel heavier, every movement amplified. Every seat was filled, yet no one spoke. All eyes were locked on the man in the wheelchair at the center of it all, Sergeant Nathan Carter. His military uniform was immaculate, though worn with time, his medals reflecting the sterile glow of the fluorescent lights above. But none of it mattered right now. The honors, the service, the sacrifices, they all paled in comparison to what he stood to lose. At his side sat a German shepherd, posture rigid, eyes sharp, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. Thor wasn't just a service dog. He was more than a partner. He was Nathan's anchor, the one being who had been there through everything, through gunfire, through sleepless nights, through battles fought on and off the field. And now the army had decided he wasn't Nathan's to keep. He was still government property, assigned to another mission, to another soldier. It felt like a cruel joke. Nathan had already given up so much, but this was too much. The judge, an older man with a deeply lined face, cleared his throat before speaking, his voice measured but firm. "Sergeant Carter, this may be your final opportunity to present your case." Nathan inhaled sharply, steadying himself, but his hands still trembled as he gripped the leash. The words were already there, lodged in his chest, waiting to break free. He didn't care about regulations or protocol, he cared about thought. "Your Honor," he began, his voice raw, "Thor isn't just a military asset, he's my family." He paused, swallowing the lump forming in his throat. "On the battlefield, he saved my life. He pulled me out of harm's way, shielded me from gunfire, warned me about traps before I even saw them. But it wasn't just out there." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "When I came home, when I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror, when everything felt—" He stopped, shaking his head before continuing. "He was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." A heavy silence followed. The weight of his words settled over the room like a dense fog. Some in the audience wiped at their eyes. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions flickering between pity and frustration. But the judge remained unreadable, his fingers tapping slowly against the desk as he considered the plea before him. Nathan's breath hitched. He had been through war, had stared down death more times than he cared to remember, but nothing had felt as terrifying as this moment, waiting for a decision that could tear his world apart. The judge leaned forward slightly, his lips parting as he prepared to speak. Then, before he could utter a single word, Thor moved. The dog leapt to his feet, yanking the leash from Nathan's weakened grip, his sharp bark slicing through the room like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The bailiffs tensed, stepping forward instinctively, hands hovering near their weapons. The judge froze, startled by the sudden disruption. But Nathan knew better. This wasn't defiance. Thor wasn't acting out. His stance was rigid, ears pinned back, every muscle in his body coiled tight. His barking wasn't random, it was urgent. Nathan's stomach twisted. He had seen this before, too many times to count. Thor wasn't just barking, he was warning them. Thor's bark shattered the tense silence, echoing off the courtroom walls like an alarm that only he could hear. His body was tense, every muscle coiled like a spring, his sharp eyes locked onto something no one else could see. Nathan's heart pounded as he instinctively reached for the leash, but it had already slipped from his trembling hands. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't nervous energy. This was something else, something Nathan had seen before, too many times to count. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people exchanged worried glances. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered, but Nathan already knew. Thor didn't bark like this unless there was danger. Real danger, the kind that sent ice through Nathan's veins on the battlefield. The judge's grip on his gavel tightened, his once neutral expression now edged with unease. "Control your dog, Mr. Carter," he ordered, his voice attempting authority, but even he couldn't mask the slight tremor beneath his words. Nathan wheeled himself forward, his breath coming fast. "He's not just barking," he said, his voice sharp, urgent. "He's trained to detect threats, explosives, enemies. He doesn't react to nothing." His words sent a ripple of dread through the room, the tension shifting from confusion to something darker, something primal. The judge hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the bailiffs. The larger of the two, a man with a broad chest and a wary expression, stepped forward, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. Probably just reacting to the noise, he muttered, though his cautious steps betrayed his own doubt. But Nathan knew better. Thor's instincts had never failed him before. The dog had saved his life too many times to count. As if in response to Nathan's thoughts, Thor's barking stopped suddenly. The abrupt silence was deafening. His ears snapped forward, his body rigid, his head turning toward the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom. A deep, menacing growl rumbled from his chest, low and guttural, a warning that sent a chill through everyone present. A thick unease settled over the room as all eyes turned toward the doors. The bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances before one of them, the larger man, moved cautiously forward. His fingers curled around the metal handle, hesitating for just a second before he twisted it open. The door creaked, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. At first, it looked empty, nothing but polished tile and flickering fluorescent lights. But Thor's growling didn't stop. It only deepened, his stance lowering as if preparing to lunge. The smaller bailiff lifted a flashlight, casting a beam down the corridor. "There's nothing," he murmured, but his voice wavered. And then clang! A sharp metallic sound rang out from the hallway, unmistakable, like something heavy being dropped or shifted. The bailiff flinched, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. Thor erupted again, barking furiously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained toward the unseen threat. Panic rippled through the courtroom, spectators shifting in their seats, some inching toward the exits. The larger bailiff drew his weapon, his voice tense. What the hell was that? Nathan didn't hesitate. His voice cut through the rising noise, his hands gripping his wheels, his pulse hammering. "Get everyone out of here. Now." But before anyone could move, before the judge could even give an order, the metallic clang echoed again, closer this time. And suddenly, it was no longer just a warning. It was happening. The second metallic clang rang through the air, louder, closer. The tension in the room snapped tighter, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone present. Thor's barking turned frenzied, his powerful body straining forward, as if his sheer will could break through the leash and confront whatever was lurking beyond the open doorway. Nathan gripped the wheels of his chair, every nerve in his body screaming at him to do something, to act before it was too late. The bailiffs hesitated, their eyes darting between each other, unsure of whether to stand their ground or retreat. The judge, normally a figure of unwavering authority, now looked shaken, his gavel gripped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "What is going on out there?" he demanded, his voice trying to regain control, but it cracked slightly, betraying his unease. The larger bailiff stepped cautiously into the hallway, his weapon drawn, his partner close behind, flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam of light cut through the dim corridor, scanning every shadow, every darkened corner. "I don't see anything," the bailiff called back, but his voice was uncertain. "But something doesn't feel right." Nathan's pulse quickened, his mind flashing back to moments on the battlefield, to nights when the silence before an ambush was suffocating, when danger was felt before it was seen. "Thor doesn't react to nothing," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "If he's acting like this, there's a reason." The judge hesitated, looking from Nathan to the hallway, as if weighing whether to dismiss his claim or take it seriously. Before he could decide, movement, just the briefest flicker of a shadow, crossed the far end of the corridor. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but enough to send the smaller bailiff stumbling back, his flashlight jerking wildly. "There," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. The larger bailiff immediately snapped his gun up, his body tense. The crowd inside the courtroom gasped, whispers turning into frightened murmurs. Nathan wheeled himself forward, his stomach twisting. Then came the sound that sent a fresh wave of terror through the room, a heavy, deliberate footstep. Slow, measured, unhurried. It wasn't the frantic movement of someone running. It was calm, purposeful, and it was getting closer. Thor's barking turned into a vicious snarl, his teeth bared, his entire body pushing against the leash with unrelenting force. Nathan had to anchor himself, gripping tightly to keep from being pulled forward. Every eye in the room locked onto the dark hallway, waiting for the figure to emerge. Then, out of the shadows, a man stepped into the dim light. He was tall, his face obscured by the deep hood of his coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, as though he hadn't just caused an entire courtroom to descend into chaos. He moved with unsettling confidence, his posture relaxed, as if he belonged there. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice firm despite the tension thick in the air. "Show yourself. Step forward." The man did as he was told, but there was something in the way he moved that sent chills down Nathan's spine, too calm, too deliberate. Then, for the first time, the man spoke. "Relax," he said, his voice smooth, eerily composed. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." But the way the words hung in the air, cold and hollow, only made the room feel smaller, the fear more suffocating. Nathan's gut twisted. He knew, deep down, that this man was lying. And so did Thor. The stranger stood just inside the doorway, his posture unnervingly relaxed, despite the weapons pointed at him and the fear rippling through the courtroom. The hood of his coat cast a shadow over his face, but what little could be seen was sharp, calculating. His hands remained tucked into his pockets, and he took another slow step forward, the heavy click of his boot against the tile unnerving in the oppressive silence. The larger bailiff's gun stayed trained on him, his stance unwavering, but his breathing was shallow. "I said stop," he barked, his voice tight with restrained fear. The man did stop, but not because he was intimidated. It was controlled, deliberate, like he was savoring the attention. His head tilted slightly, his gaze flickering toward Thor, whose growls had not ceased. Nathan felt Thor's body tensed like a coiled spring, the dog's powerful muscles trembling under the strain of holding himself back. Nathan tightened his grip on the leash, his knuckles white. The man exhaled, almost amused. "That dog," he said, his voice smooth, unsettling. "He's special, isn't he?" His lips curled slightly, as if the chaos he had caused was nothing more than an entertaining performance. "Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." Nathan's stomach dropped. He had never spoken to this man before, had never seen him, and yet he knew. He knew about Thor, about his instincts, about the things that couldn't be explained, only trusted. The air in the room grew colder, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on everyone. The smaller bailiff took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight shaking slightly. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice uneven. "How do you know about the dog?" The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, moving slowly enough not to trigger an immediate reaction from the armed bailiffs. But the moment his hand disappeared into the fabric, both officers tensed, their weapons rising slightly. Nathan felt his heartbeat slam against his ribs. Thor's growl deepened, his entire body practically vibrating with rage. The courtroom spectators held their breath, paralyzed between fight and flight. And then, the stranger pulled out a small metallic object, holding it up between his fingers. A key. It glinted under the harsh overhead lights, but instead of relief washing over the room, the tension only thickened. The larger bailiff's voice rang out sharply. "Drop it." The man didn't. Instead, his smirk deepened, and with an eerie slowness, he turned the key in his hand. There was a soft metallic click. The moment the sound echoed through the air, the lights flickered violently. Gasps and shouts erupted from all around. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor as people fumbled in panic. Nathan gripped Thor's leash with everything he had, his instincts screaming that whatever was happening had just escalated into something far worse. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was no longer alone. Two figures had emerged from the dark hallway behind him, their faces obscured, their movements precise and controlled. Unlike the man in the hood, they were armed, blades glinting ominously in their hands. Thor barked furiously, his body pushing against the leash with force, Nathan barely managed to restrain. The larger bailiff cursed under his breath, his gun shifting toward the new threats. The judge, looking pale and shaken, slammed his gavel, though the act was meaningless now. "Enough," he shouted, but his voice held no authority anymore. Only fear. The stranger's smirk didn't waver. "No one needs to get hurt," he said casually, his tone almost bored. "All I want is the dog." Nathan's grip on Thor tightened until his fingers ached. His voice, steady but filled with defiance, cut through the rising chaos. "You're not taking him." The stranger's smirk faded. His expression darkened. And Nathan knew this was far from over. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy and unmoving. The stranger's words still echoed, hanging over the courtroom like a storm cloud waiting to break. The bailiffs stood their ground, their hands steady on their weapons, but their eyes betrayed their hesitation. This wasn't the kind of threat they were trained to handle. The judge, his authority shaken, exhaled sharply and gripped his gavel as if it was the only thing tethering him to control. "You have no right to be here," he declared, his voice uneven but determined. "This is over. Bailiffs, remove these men." But the stranger only smiled, his head tilting slightly, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Over," he repeated, his voice carrying a quiet amusement. "Not quite." His gaze slid back to Nathan, then to Thor, who remained unmoving, his body rigid with alertness. "You don't understand what you have," the man said, almost as if he pitied them. "But you will." Then, just like that, he stepped back. His two men followed without a word, their retreat slow, deliberate. The moment the door shut behind them, the room seemed to let out a collective breath. But Nathan didn't relax. He knew this wasn't the end. Thor sat back on his haunches, his growl fading, though his muscles remained tight, ready. Nathan ran a hand over the dog's back, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of his fur. His heart was still racing, his mind turning over the words the stranger had left behind. "You don't understand what you have." But he did. He had known it the moment Thor pulled him from the wreckage of a bombed-out convoy, the moment he had stood beside him through sleepless nights, through the weight of survival. Thor wasn't just a military asset or a highly trained nine, he was family. And Nathan had fought too hard, lost too much to let him go. Around him, the courtroom buzzed with anxious whispers. People were gathering their belongings, shaking their heads, still trying to process what had just happened. The judge finally spoke again, his voice quiet and tired. "This court is adjourned," he muttered, setting his gavel down with a dull thud. But Nathan barely heard him. His focus remained on the door, the one that now felt like a threshold between what had been and what was coming. Because whatever this was, whatever they wanted, it wasn't over. As the room emptied, Nathan remained seated, his fingers still curled in Thor's fur. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, the battlefield, the sacrifices, the way people only saw Thor as a tool, a resource, something to be used and reassigned. But Thor was more than that. He'd given Nathan hope when there was none, had stood by him when no one else did. And that loyalty, unquestioning, unbreakable, was something the world often overlooked. People always talked about heroism in grand, dramatic gestures, but sometimes real heroism was found in the quiet, unwavering presence of someone who refused to leave your side. That was Thor. That was the bond they shared. And it was a reminder of something bigger, that loyalty isn't given, it's earned. That family isn't always defined by blood, but by the ones who choose to stand beside you no matter what. As Thor finally relaxed against his leg, Nathan let himself breathe. He didn't know what was coming next, but whatever it was, they would face it together. Because in a world that tried to take away everything, some things, some bonds were worth fighting for,